June 22nd, 1941. At precisely 3:15 in the morning, the stillness of a Soviet summer night shattered under the roar of engines and the thunder of artillery. Along an 1,800-mile frontier, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, the German Wehrmacht unleashed the largest invasion force in human history. 3 million men, 600,000 vehicles, 3,500 tanks, and 2,700 aircraft surged eastward in a storm of fire and steel. For Adolf Hitler, this was more than a campaign. It was the fulfillment of a dark vision, a crusade against what he called Judeo-Bolshevism, a war to enslave and annihilate. The land of the Soviet Union was to be carved into living space, its people reduced to servants, its cities starved or erased. The Nazi state named it Operation Barbarossa, invoking the medieval emperor Frederick Barbarossa. But this was no romantic conquest. It was the beginning of the most brutal war humanity had ever seen. In the first hours alone, the balance of power collapsed. Soviet airfields were bombed before their planes could even take off. Entire regiments burned on the ground. By noon, German panzers had punched holes through Soviet lines in Belarus and Ukraine. In less than a week, whole armies vanished in encirclements so vast they seemed impossible. Stalin himself, stunned into silence, refused to believe the scale of the catastrophe. But behind the headlines of advancing German columns, another war was unfolding. A war of annihilation. Einsatzgruppen, Nazi death squads, followed the soldiers, executing Jews, communists, and civilians by the tens of thousands. In villages and towns, people awoke to gunfire, deportations, and hunger. For millions, Barbarossa was not only an invasion, it was the start of a nightmare. This was Hitler's greatest gamble, to destroy the Soviet Union in one swift stroke. Yet as the summer sun burned over the Russian steppe, and as the armies advanced deeper into hostile land, the seeds of German failure were already being sown. For what began as lightning war would end in frozen despair and in the ruins of Hitler's dream.
To understand why Hitler risked everything on an invasion of the Soviet Union, we must step back to the uneasy calm of 1939. 2 years before the panzers roared across the frontier, Germany and the Soviet Union had shocked the world with a pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Signed in August, it declared non-aggression between the two states. But beneath its surface lay secret clauses, the carving up of Poland, the domination of the Baltic states, and spheres of influence that turned Eastern Europe into a chessboard of dictators. For Stalin, the agreement was a temporary shield. The Red Army was still reeling from his purges of the officer corps in the late 1930s, where thousands of experienced commanders had been executed or imprisoned. His goal was time to rebuild, time to industrialize, time to prepare for the war he knew was coming. For Hitler, the pact was a convenience. It gave him a free hand to unleash war on Poland without fear of Soviet intervention. In September 1939, as German troops invaded from the west, Soviet forces marched from the east, and the Polish state was erased in weeks. The two regimes exchanged resources as well as territory. Soviet oil, grain, and raw materials fueled the Nazi war machine. German industrial equipment and military technology flowed the other way. To the outside world, it looked like an unholy alliance. But beneath the trade deals and photo opportunities, neither side trusted the other. Hitler's ambitions reached far beyond cooperation. In Mein Kampf, he had already promised that Germany's destiny lay in the east. The vast lands of Russia and Ukraine would be Germany's living space. Their people, Slavs, Jews, communists, were to be enslaved or destroyed. This was not strategy alone. It was ideology. By 1940, the pace of events accelerated. Germany crushed France in just 6 weeks, stunning the world and leaving Britain to fight on alone. In Berlin, the generals pressed Hitler to consolidate, to finish off Britain. But Hitler's eyes turned east. He was convinced that Britain held out only in the hope of a Soviet ally. Destroy Russia, he believed, and Britain would collapse. The Balkan campaign of 1941 delayed his plans by precious weeks, but Hitler was undeterred. In December 1940, he signed Directive No. 21, the blueprint for Operation Barbarossa. It called for the Soviet Union to be destroyed in a single lightning campaign, with the Red Army smashed near the frontier, and European Russia conquered in less than 6 months. German planners underestimated everything: the resilience of Soviet industry, the depth of its manpower, the harshness of its climate, the vastness of its territory. Their maps ended at the Urals, as if beyond them lay emptiness. But in Moscow, even amid purges and paranoia, Stalin had been watching. He received intelligence from spies, warnings from allies, and even from his own generals. Yet he clung to the pact, hoping Hitler would not strike before the Soviet Union was ready. On paper, Barbarossa looked like the final stroke that would deliver Germany hegemony over Europe. In reality, it was the prelude to a war that would consume tens of millions of lives. In December 1940, Adolf Hitler signed a document that sealed the fate of millions. It was called Directive No. 21, better known by its code name, Barbarossa. Its words were cold and clinical. Germany, it declared, must be prepared to crush the Soviet Union in a short campaign. The Red Army was to be annihilated in Western Russia, the heartland of European Russia was to be seized, and the operation was to be completed before winter. This was not the work of a cautious statesman. It was the design of a gambler intoxicated by success. Hitler's armies had overrun Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and France in barely a year. His blitzkrieg had shattered armies in weeks that the First World War could not defeat in years. To him, the Soviet Union appeared even more vulnerable, colossus with feet of clay, weakened by Stalin's purges, poorly led, and held together, he believed, only by terror. The plan was deceptively simple. 3 vast army groups would fan out across an 1,800-mile front. Army Group North, under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, would strike through the Baltic states and seize Leningrad. Its fall would sever the Soviet Union from the Baltic and link Germany to its ally Finland. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, was the most powerful. Its goal: smash through Belarus, capture Smolensk, and then drive straight for Moscow, the Soviet capital, nerve center, and symbolic prize. Army Group South, led by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, would sweep into Ukraine, Europe's breadbasket, capturing its grain, coal, and eventually its oil fields in the Caucasus. The intent was clear: destroy the Red Army in a series of rapid encirclements near the frontier, then occupy the major political and economic centers before the Soviets could regroup. Germany's generals estimated it could be done in 10 to 12 weeks. Hitler boasted it would take only a few months. The scale was staggering. Germany committed nearly 3 million men, about 80% of its army, supported by 600,000 vehicles, 3,500 tanks, and more than 2,000 aircraft. To this were added 500,000 soldiers from Romania, Hungary, and Finland, eager to reclaim lost lands or settle old scores. It was the largest invasion force in history. The Wehrmacht had proven itself efficient and lethal in Europe, but there were cracks beneath the surface. Germany had never fought a campaign on this scale before. The distances of Russia dwarfed anything in the West. Logistics, not tactics, would decide this war, and Germany's supply system was fragile. Its trucks were few. Its horses, more than 600,000 of them, still pulled the bulk of supplies. The railways in the Soviet Union ran on a broader gauge than those in Europe, meaning captured lines had to be torn up and relayed before German trains could roll east. Few in Berlin appreciated what this meant. Barbarossa was not only a military operation. It was an ideological war of annihilation. Months before the invasion, Hitler and his generals signed off on documents that revealed the true intent. The Barbarossa Decree freed German soldiers from accountability for crimes committed against civilians. The Commissar order demanded the immediate execution of captured Soviet political officers. The Hunger Plan, drafted by Nazi economic planners, envisioned the starvation of tens of millions in Soviet cities so that German troops could be fed. Behind the front lines, the Einsatzgruppen, special SS killing units, were assigned to eliminate Jews, communists, and so-called undesirables. The invasion was to be both conquest and extermination. In the winter and spring of 1941, German planners refined the details. Hitler insisted that the destruction of the Soviet armies mattered more than the capture of Moscow. Many generals disagreed. They argued that Moscow, with its rail hubs, political authority, and industrial concentration, was the true key. But Hitler dismissed them, believing the Soviet Union would collapse once its armies were smashed in the western borderlands. The intelligence assessments reinforced this hubris. German reports concluded that the Soviet Union had only about 200 divisions, most of them poorly equipped and poorly led. In reality, the Red Army had over 300 divisions, and though many were under strength, their sheer numbers dwarfed German assumptions. Soviet tank models like the T-34 and KV-1 were barely known to German intelligence, and when they appeared on the battlefield they would shock German crews. On the other side of the frontier, Stalin and his generals were not blind. Reports flooded Moscow from spies and foreign governments warning of German intentions. Even Richard Sword, the famous Soviet spy in Tokyo, relayed the invasion date with remarkable accuracy. But Stalin, still convinced that Hitler would not risk a two-front war before Britain was defeated, dismissed many of the warnings as British propaganda designed to lure him into conflict. The Red Army, meanwhile, was in transition. Stalin's purges had executed or imprisoned more than 35,000 officers. Entire chains of command had been decapitated. Though the Soviet Union had enormous numbers of tanks and planes, many were obsolete, badly maintained, or scattered in exposed forward positions. Communication was slow, logistics were fragile. In theory, the Red Army was vast. In practice, it was brittle. By May 1941, the preparations were almost complete. German divisions massed in Poland, East Prussia, and Romania. Camouflage and deception operations tried to mask their presence, but Soviet reconnaissance noticed the buildup. Stalin, however, still held to his belief: Hitler would not strike yet. On June 21, 1941, German commanders opened sealed envelopes containing their final orders. The next morning, at 3:15, the guns would open fire. Barbarossa was ready. On the eve of Barbarossa, the Soviet Union appeared outwardly powerful, yet dangerously fragile. To the outside world, it was a giant, a nation of nearly 200 million people, stretching across 11 time zones, commanding immense reserves of oil, coal, steel, and grain. Its army was among the largest in the world, with more than 5 million men under arms. And yet, beneath the surface, its foundation seemed unsteady. The first weakness was of Stalin's own making. In the late 1930s, terrified of rivals and conspiracies, he unleashed the Great Purge. Tens of thousands of officers, from marshals to junior commanders, were executed, imprisoned, or sent to labor camps. The Red Army lost 3 of its 5 marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, and more than half its officer corps. Those who replaced them were often inexperienced, promoted for loyalty rather than competence. By 1941, this trauma still haunted the Red Army. Many commanders feared to act independently, lest boldness be mistaken for treachery. Orders from above were often obeyed rigidly, even when battlefield reality demanded flexibility. Hitler's intelligence agency studied these purges and concluded, wrongly but fatally for German planning, that the Red Army was incapable of serious resistance. Yet Stalin's Russia was not helpless. During the 1930s, the Soviet Union had undergone rapid industrialization. New factories in the Urals and Siberia poured out tanks, aircraft, and weapons. By 1941, the Red Army possessed more than 20,000 tanks, more than the rest of the world combined. Most were obsolete, but among them were new models that would shock the Germans: the T-34, with its sloped armor and 76mm gun, and the KV-1, a heavy tank virtually impervious to early German weapons. The Air Force too was vast, nearly 10,000 aircraft in the western districts alone. Many were outdated biplanes, but newer designs like the Yak-1 and MiG-3 were arriving in increasing numbers. On paper, the Soviet arsenal dwarfed the Wehrmacht's. The problem was organization, training, and deployment. In the months before the invasion, the Red Army began shifting forces forward, closer to the new frontier created by the 1939 partition of Poland. Divisions dug in near Brest, Lvov, and Białystok. Airfields were built close to the border. But this forward deployment made them highly vulnerable. When the Germans struck, hundreds of planes were caught on the ground. Entire armies were enveloped before they could retreat. Stalin's insistence on avoiding provocation compounded the danger. Even as reports came in of German forces massing, Soviet units were forbidden to take defensive measures. Ammunition was stored in depots rather than issued. Planes were not dispersed. Troops were told not to respond to provocations, lest it give Hitler an excuse for war. The Soviet intelligence network provided repeated, urgent warnings. Richard Sorg, the brilliant Soviet spy in Tokyo, reported the exact date of the German attack. British and American sources passed along similar information. Even within the Soviet Union, border commanders saw what was coming. But Stalin refused to believe it. He suspected a trap, that Churchill and the British were trying to lure him into war with Germany. Hitler is not such a fool as to fight on 2 fronts, Stalin remarked in May 1941. To the dictator, logic dictated that Germany would not risk attacking until Britain was defeated. That logic would cost him dearly. Beyond the military, the Soviet Union itself was a paradox. Its economy had grown rapidly but was rigid and centrally controlled. Its people lived under surveillance and fear, yet many also carried deep pride in the nation's survival and achievements. The Communist Party's grip was absolute, but beneath the surface, resentment simmered. In the western regions of Ukraine and the Baltics, recently annexed in 1939 to 1940, many saw Soviet rule as oppressive and greeted the German invaders at first as liberators, a fact Hitler's policies of brutality would soon squander. Germany's greatest miscalculation was underestimating the Soviet Union's reserves of manpower and industry. Beyond the Dnieper and Volga rivers lay the factories of the Urals and Siberia, out of reach of German bombers. Within weeks of the invasion, whole factories would be dismantled, loaded on trains, and shipped east to resume production behind the front. Stalin's regime, for all its brutality, had the capacity to mobilize resources on a scale no other nation could match. Most of all, Germany underestimated the Soviet people's will to resist. Fear of Stalin was real, but when the invasion came, the struggle became something greater than ideology. It was a fight for survival, for home, for family. Villagers armed themselves with scythes and rifles. Workers joined militias. Soldiers fought to the last bullet in encircled cauldrons. Barbarossa was meant to shatter Soviet morale in weeks. Instead, it forged a war of endurance that would last 4 long years. On June 21, 1941, as German soldiers received their sealed orders and tanks rumbled into position, life in the Soviet Union carried on in uneasy quiet. Farmers tilled the soil, unaware that within hours their villages would be engulfed in flames. In Moscow, Stalin remained convinced war was not yet at hand. At the border, Soviet sentries peered into the darkness and saw only the faint glow of campfires, not knowing they were looking at the greatest army ever assembled, waiting for the order to strike. The Soviet Union was about to endure the most devastating assault in its history. Its armies were vast but vulnerable, its leadership brutal but unprepared. The storm of Barbarossa would break in hours, and with it, the course of the 20th century would change forever. At 3:15 in the morning on June 22, 1941, the first shots were fired. Along the western frontier of the Soviet Union, the sky lit up with the thunder of more than 7,000 German guns. Artillery rained down on bunkers, bridges, and border posts. The deafening roar rolled across an 1,800-mile front, the beginning of the largest invasion in the history of warfare. Within minutes, the Luftwaffe joined in. Waves of bombers struck Soviet airfields, fuel depots. In Moscow, Stalin at first refused to believe the reports. When his generals urged him to order a general mobilization, he hesitated. His paranoia, his fear of acting without full certainty, paralyzed the Soviet response. For nearly 2 days, confusion reigned in the Soviet capital. Railway networks jammed as units tried to move east, often without clear orders. Ammunition depots were abandoned. Entire armies, still under command to hold the line, were swallowed in German encirclements. When Stalin finally addressed the nation on July 3, it was with unusual frankness. He admitted that the country faced a mortal threat. But he framed the conflict not merely as a war between states, it was a great patriotic war, a struggle for survival of the Russian people. For civilians in the path of the Wehrmacht, the invasion was apocalypse. In villages along the frontier, families awoke to the sound of explosions, to columns of tanks rolling past their homes. The German army was followed by the Einsatzgruppen, special SS units tasked with mass executions. In Lithuania, Latvia, and Ukraine, mass shootings began within days. Jews, communists, intellectuals, anyone marked as undesirable, were lined up and shot in pits on the outskirts of towns. In the forests near Vilnius, in the ravines near Kiev, the ground itself became a grave. In the first weeks, German commanders were euphoric. The encirclements at Minsk and Smolensk destroyed entire Soviet armies. Columns of prisoners, starved, exhausted, stripped of weapons, marched west in their hundreds of thousands. One German officer wrote home that the campaign was essentially won, that it was only a matter of time before Moscow fell. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. The rapid advances stretched supply lines thin. Fuel and ammunition struggled to keep pace with the spearheads. Roads clogged with retreating Soviet soldiers, fleeing civilians, and burning wreckage slowed the advance. Each mile gained drew the Wehrmacht deeper into a land vast beyond imagination. Even amid catastrophe, the Soviet Union began to adapt. New armies were mobilized from reserves. Factories began the extraordinary process of dismantling and moving eastward, beyond the reach of German bombers. Civilians dug defenses around Moscow, while partisan groups formed in forests and swamps, striking at German supply lines. The initial shock of Barbarossa was devastating, a military disaster of colossal scale. But it did not bring the collapse Hitler had promised. Instead, it ignited a war of annihilation, one that would consume millions. By the end of July, the Wehrmacht had advanced hundreds of miles, captured vast territories, and destroyed or captured nearly 2 million Soviet soldiers. Yet the Red Army was not finished. For every division destroyed, new ones were forming farther east. For every town captured, another line of defense emerged. Barbarossa had begun in fire and thunder, but already, in the heat of that summer, the first signs appeared that Germany had underestimated its foe. The summer of 1941 was a season of fire. Across the Western Soviet Union, cities burned, armies collapsed, and millions were swept up in the storm unleashed by Hitler's war of annihilation. Army Group North, toward Leningrad. In the north, Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb's Army Group North surged through the Baltic states. Riga fell in early July, its streets scarred by shellfire and its Jewish population marked for destruction. The Wehrmacht pressed onward toward Leningrad, the city of the revolution, birthplace of Bolshevism. German troops believed its fall was only weeks away. Behind them, the SS and auxiliary police units carried out their orders. In Lithuania and Latvia, Einsatzgruppen units shot thousands of Jews and communists. In towns like Kaunas and Riga, local collaborators joined in. What began as military conquest quickly turned into mass murder. The campaign was not only about territory, it was about erasing entire communities. By August, Army Group North had reached the outskirts of Leningrad. There, the fighting slowed. Soviet resistance stiffened, trenches were dug, and the first seeds of what would become the 900-day siege of Leningrad were planted. Army Group Center, the road to Smolensk. At the heart of Barbarossa, Army Group Center advanced with breathtaking speed. Its twin panzer groups, under Guderian and Hoth, raced across Belarus. Minsk fell by the end of June, with over 300,000 Soviet troops trapped in a vast encirclement. But the Germans did not pause. By mid-July, they closed another pocket at Smolensk, capturing another 200,000 men. The road to Moscow lay open. German officers pressed for an immediate drive on the capital, convinced that one final push would end the war. But Hitler hesitated. He diverted forces south toward Ukraine, hunting for resources and another grand encirclement. This pause would prove costly. Even as Army Group Center advanced, the Soviets began to show signs of resilience. New armies were rushed to the front. The T-34 tank, appearing in small numbers, shocked German panzer crews with its sloped armor and powerful gun. Though losses remained catastrophic, the Soviet Union was not collapsing as quickly as German planners had promised. Army Group South, the struggle for Ukraine. In the south, Field Marshal von Rundstedt's Army Group South faced the heaviest resistance. Ukraine was rich in grain, coal, and industry, and Hitler coveted it. But its defenders fought tenaciously. At the Battle of Brody in late June, Soviet tank formations launched massive counterattacks, fielding hundreds of armored vehicles. Poorly coordinated and badly led, they suffered devastating losses.
Shows the Battle of Stalingrad.
Yet the scale of the battle shocked the Germans.
Battle in history, fought between
the Red Army had far more tanks than intelligence had suggested. Through July and August, the Germans pressed deeper. Towns like Zhytomyr and Vinnytsia fell in flames. Civilians fled in endless columns, carts piled with belongings, children clinging to their mothers. Hunger and disease spread as the front devoured everything in its path. By September, the Germans executed one of the greatest encirclements in military history. At Kiev, a vast pincer closed around the Soviet southwestern front. More than 600,000 men were trapped. It was the single largest capture of troops in the war. Prisoners were marched west in endless columns, starved, beaten, dying by the roadside. For Stalin, it was a disaster of unimaginable proportions. The summer campaign was not only measured in battles and maps. It was lived by civilians whose homes became front lines. Einsatzgruppen massacres multiplied. In July, in the Ukrainian town of Kamyanets-Podilskyi, over 20,000 Jews were executed in a matter of days. In September, outside Kiev, a ravine called Babi Yar became a killing ground where more than 33,000 men, women, and children were shot in just 2 days. Entire villages were burned as punishment for suspected partisan activity. In Belarus, German reprisal policy meant that for every German soldier killed by partisans, dozens of civilians were executed. By the end of September, German armies had advanced more than 500 miles. They had captured vast territories, destroyed or captured more than 3 million Soviet soldiers, and inflicted losses unmatched in military history. In Berlin, propaganda declared victory. Goebbels wrote in his diary that the Soviet Union was finished. But beneath the triumph, the seeds of failure were already sprouting. Supply lines stretched across landscapes the Germans had never prepared for. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. Trucks broke down. Ammunition and fuel arrived days late. Soldiers scavenged food from the land, while planners spoke openly of starving Soviet cities into submission. The Red Army, though battered and bleeding, refused to die. New formations appeared from the east. Factories, dismantled piece by piece, were reassembling in the Urals and Siberia. Stalin's government called on the people to defend their motherland at any cost. Slowly, under the weight of unimaginable loss, the Soviet Union was learning to fight. The summer of 1941 gave Germany everything it had hoped for: victory after victory, millions of prisoners, cities captured, land conquered. Yet it also gave the Wehrmacht something it had not expected: a war that refused to end. For every Soviet army destroyed, another emerged. For every city captured, another line of defense formed. For every village subdued, partisans rose in the forests. The fire of Barbarossa burned fiercely in the summer sun. But as autumn drew near, the storm began to shift. The Wehrmacht, still victorious on paper, was beginning to discover that Russia was not merely a battlefield. It was an abyss, one that would swallow all who entered too deeply. By the end of September 1941, the German Wehrmacht had advanced farther and faster than any army in history. From the Baltic to the Black Sea, Soviet armies lay shattered, millions of prisoners marched west, and vast territories had fallen. Yet the Soviet Union still stood. Its armies, though mauled, were reforming. Its factories, dismantled and rebuilt east of the Urals, were beginning to produce anew. Its people, stunned by catastrophe, were learning to resist. For Hitler, this was not the plan. Barbarossa was supposed to end in a matter of weeks. Now the campaign dragged into autumn. But still, he believed one final blow could bring the Soviet Union to collapse. That blow would be struck at Moscow. The heart of Soviet politics, the hub of its railways, the city whose fall, he believed, would topple Stalin's regime. On October 2, 1941, Germany launched Operation Typhoon, the code name for the assault on Moscow. It was the largest single offensive of the campaign, more than 2 million German soldiers, supported by 1,000 tanks and the Luftwaffe's concentrated might. The plan mirrored the earlier successes at Minsk and Kiev. Two massive pincer movements, led by Guderian's and Hoth's panzer groups, would encircle Soviet forces west of Moscow, while infantry armies closed in behind them. Once the Red Army was destroyed, the road to Moscow would lie open. The Vyazma and Bryansk encirclements. Within weeks, the Wehrmacht achieved another devastating success. At Vyazma and Bryansk, west of Moscow, German panzers closed vast pockets, trapping nearly 700,000 Soviet soldiers. Entire Soviet fronts vanished in a matter of days. German propaganda declared victory certain. The way to Moscow seemed clear. But the Red Army did not break. Even as armies were annihilated, new ones appeared. Civilians dug trenches outside Moscow. Barricades were built in the streets. Workers were armed and formed into militias. Factories continued to turn out tanks and rifles even as bombs fell nearby. Rasputitsa, the mud season. Then came the weather. By late October, the first autumn rains turned Russia's roads into seas of mud. The infamous Rasputitsa, the season of mud, swallowed the German advance. Trucks sank axle-deep. Horses collapsed in the mire. Tanks churned forward at a crawl, their engines overheating, their crews exhausted. Supply convoys stalled, leaving frontline units short of fuel and ammunition. German soldiers, unprepared for the conditions, found themselves dragging equipment by hand. The roads disappeared before our eyes, one officer recalled. We moved forward like flies in honey. Blitzkrieg, built on speed, slowed to a crawl. In Moscow, panic gripped the population. Government offices burned documents. Evacuation plans were drawn. Rumors spread that Stalin himself was preparing to flee. But Stalin chose to stay. His decision was as much political as military. To abandon Moscow would mean surrendering the heart of the Soviet state. On November 7, as German forces approached within 50 miles of the capital, Stalin stood atop Lenin's mausoleum and presided over the annual Revolution Day parade. Columns of troops marched through Red Square, then directly to the front. It was a powerful gesture, a signal that Moscow would not fall without a fight. By November, the ground hardened. The mud gave way to frost. German commanders believed the pause was over. The final drive on Moscow resumed. Villages around Klin, Mozhaysk, and Tula fell in fierce fighting. At last, German soldiers could see the spires of Moscow through their binoculars. They were within sight of their prize. But they had reached their limit. The soldiers were exhausted. Supplies were short. And the winter, harsher than any they had imagined, was beginning to close in. The Soviet counterstroke approaches. Unknown to the Germans, reinforcements were arriving. From Siberia, fresh divisions trained and equipped for winter were being redeployed west. Intelligence confirmed that Japan would not attack the Soviet Far East, freeing these troops to defend Moscow. They were well-clothed, well-equipped, and accustomed to fighting in snow and ice. As December approached, the Wehrmacht stood on the brink of triumph, but also on the edge of disaster. The German dream of a swift victory had carried them to the gates of Moscow. Yet the Soviet Union, battered but unbroken, was about to strike back. By early December 1941, the Wehrmacht stood at the very edge of its triumph. German soldiers could see the faint outlines of Moscow's spires on the horizon. Patrols reported the glow of the city lights at night. Hitler's armies had advanced more than 500 miles in less than 6 months. They had destroyed entire Soviet fronts, captured millions of prisoners, and seized lands larger than all of Western Europe combined. Yet the closer they came to Moscow, the weaker they became. Supplies arrived in dribbles, fuel ran dry, ammunition was rationed. Most of all, the men themselves were exhausted. They had marched, fought, and starved for half a year. Their uniforms were designed for summer. Their boots cracked in the frost. Their weapons froze in their hands. Many lacked gloves, overcoats, or shelter. When temperatures dropped below -20 degrees Celsius, frostbite became as deadly as Soviet bullets. The German command had not prepared for winter because Hitler's entire plan had depended on victory before it came. Now the snow fell thick and heavy. Engines refused to start. Horses died in their thousands, their carcasses frozen stiff along the roads. Machine guns jammed, artillery shells cracked in the cold, fuel turned to slush. The Wehrmacht, designed for movement, found itself bogged down in conditions it could neither control nor endure. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the mood shifted. What had seemed a city on the brink of collapse now burned with defiance. Stalin stayed in the capital, defying both his generals and his own fears. On November 7, he had stood on the platform above Lenin's mausoleum as columns of Soviet troops paraded through Red Square. Many of those same men marched directly from the parade to the front lines. The gesture was as symbolic as it was strategic. Moscow would not be abandoned. Then came the reinforcements. For months, Soviet spies had assured Stalin that Japan would not attack in the Far East. With that threat lifted, entire divisions from Siberia and the Urals, hardened by bitter winters, trained in snow warfare, and equipped with fur-lined coats and skis, were redeployed west. By December, these fresh troops were arriving outside Moscow in force. They joined the battered remnants of the Red Army, men who had already endured the disasters of Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev. Together, they formed a defensive wall around the Soviet capital. And behind them, civilians labored day and night, digging trenches, building fortifications, and laying mines. Moscow had become a fortress. On December 5, 1941, the Red Army struck back. Entire divisions, supported by tanks and artillery, surged out of the snow. German soldiers, already at the limit of endurance, were stunned by the sudden ferocity of the assault.
Shows the Battle of
The
Stalingrad
Soviets
during
drove
World
them
War
from
II.
Klin, from
The
Kalinin,
deadliest battle in
from the
history,
approaches to
fought between
Tula.
Nazi Germany and the Soviet
Over the
Union.
next weeks, the Germans were forced into retreat. For the first time since the war began, the Wehrmacht lost the initiative. Soldiers who had believed themselves invincible now stumbled backward in the snow, leaving behind guns, vehicles, and comrades too frozen to move. German commanders pleaded for defensive lines to be drawn. Hitler refused. He forbade retreats, ordering his men to hold every position, to the last man. But reality could not be commanded. The German front bent and buckled. In places, entire units dissolved. The image of Blitzkrieg, lightning fast and unstoppable, was shattered. For the Soviets, the counteroffensive was more than a military victory. It was proof that the invader could be stopped. The myth of German invincibility, which had terrorized soldiers and civilians alike, was broken. In Moscow, the relief was electric. Newspapers spoke of heroism, of the motherland's survival, of Stalin's wisdom in staying to fight. For German soldiers, the realization was crushing. They had marched across Europe in triumph, believing themselves masters of war. Now they found themselves freezing, starving, and retreating in a land that seemed endless. Letters home spoke not of victory, but of despair. One soldier wrote, "We are not men anymore, but ghosts, stumbling in the snow." As the counteroffensive raged outside Moscow, events elsewhere reshaped the war. On December 7th, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. 4 days later, Hitler declared war on the United States. A conflict that had begun as a European war now became global. For Germany, still locked in battle with the Soviet Union, it meant a new and powerful enemy had entered the fight. By January 1942, the Germans had been driven back nearly 100 miles from Moscow. The Soviet capital remained in Soviet hands. Hitler's greatest gamble, the swift destruction of the Soviet Union, had failed. What was supposed to be a lightning war had become a war of attrition. The Battle of Moscow marked the first great defeat of Nazi Germany. It proved that the Red Army, though battered and bloodied, could not be broken. It marked the end of Barbarossa's promise of quick victory, and the beginning of a long, brutal struggle that would bleed the Wehrmacht dry. Operation Barbarossa was not merely the largest military invasion in history. It was also one of the greatest human catastrophes ever inflicted on a continent. Behind the thunder of artillery and the rumble of tanks, another war unfolded, one not fought on battlefields, but in villages, forests, and city streets. It was a war against entire populations. Before the invasion began, Hitler had made his intentions clear. The Red Army was not to be treated as an honorable foe. Political officers, commissars, were to be executed on sight. German soldiers were instructed to show no mercy, and no discipline would be enforced for crimes against Soviet civilians. In Hitler's words, this was not a traditional war. It was a racial struggle. The consequences were immediate. What the bullets began. For the German High Command, their deaths were not an accident, it was policy. Soviet prisoners were deemed subhuman, unworthy of the rations required to keep them alive. Trailing the Wehrmacht were the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads of the SS. Their mission was chillingly simple: eliminate Jews, communists, and anyone deemed a threat to German rule. They worked with ruthless efficiency. Town by town, village by village, Jews were rounded up, marched to the edge of pits or ravines, and gunned down. In the Ukrainian capital of Kiev, a ravine called Babi Yar became infamous. On September 29th and 30th, 1941, more than 33,000 Jewish men, women, and children were executed in just 48 hours. The gunfire echoed day and night, until silence fell over the mass grave. It was the largest single massacre of Jews in the war up to that point, and only the beginning. Nazi planners had also conceived the hunger plan. The idea was to starve the Soviet Union cities, especially those not immediately needed for German industry. Food would be seized for the Wehrmacht, while millions of civilians were left to die. In occupied Ukraine, grain harvests were confiscated, leaving villages to waste away. In the siege of Leningrad, where German forces encircled the city for nearly 900 days, hunger became the deadliest weapon of all. By the end, more than 1 million civilians had perished, many reduced to eating sawdust, wallpaper paste, and the flesh of animals, or, in some desperate cases, of humans.
This restored footage
burned villages
shows the
and
Battle of
partisan
Stalingrad
warfare.
during World War II.
As the Wehrmacht
deadliest battle in
advanced
history,
deeper,
fought
partisan
between Nazi
resistance
Germany
grew.
and the Soviet Union.
Soviet guerrillas sabotaged supply lines, derailed trains, and ambushed patrols. In response, the Germans adopted brutal reprisal policies. Entire villages were burned, their inhabitants shot or driven into the forests. In Belarus alone, more than 5,000 villages were destroyed, many wiped from the map forever. For civilians caught between the armies, survival was a daily struggle. Families fled east in endless columns, carrying only what they could drag. Others stayed, hiding in cellars as their homes were shelled to rubble. In Ukraine and the Baltics, some initially greeted the Germans as liberators from Stalin's rule. But hopes of freedom quickly died under the weight of Nazi occupation, forced labor, and massacres. By the end of 1941, Barbarossa had left behind a trail of destruction unlike anything Europe had seen. Millions of Soviet soldiers were dead or in captivity. Civilians had been massacred, starved, or burned out of their homes. Entire communities, especially Jewish ones, had been annihilated. Barbarossa was more than a failed invasion. It was the opening act of a genocide. The lines between military and civilian had been erased, replaced by a doctrine of extermination. For Hitler, this was the real purpose of the war in the East, not simply conquest, but the reshaping of Europe through destruction. Operation Barbarossa was not only the largest invasion in history. It was also one of the most analyzed. From the moment the first German guns opened fire in June 1941, myths and controversies have swirled around the campaign. Some of these arose from wartime propaganda, others from Cold War politics. Even today, historians debate the what-ifs of Hitler's greatest gamble. One of the most enduring controversies is whether Hitler struck first to prevent a Soviet attack. Some argue that Stalin, too, was preparing to invade Germany in 1941, and that Barbarossa was a preemptive strike. This idea gained traction from Soviet deployments near the frontier and intelligence about offensive war plans. Documents discovered after the war, especially during the Cold War, were used by some historians to claim Stalin intended to attack. But most scholars reject this. While Soviet forces were indeed massed forward, they were poorly coordinated, ill-prepared, and not in offensive posture. Stalin's directives in June 1941 ordered soldiers not to provoke the Germans, even forbidding defensive preparations. Soviet archives opened after the collapse of the USSR reveal no concrete operational orders for an imminent Soviet invasion. Instead, the evidence suggests Stalin was trying to delay war as long as possible, not hasten it. Another debated point: did Germany's diversion into Yugoslavia and Greece in spring 1941 fatally delay the assault on the Soviet Union? The campaign in the Balkans certainly cost time. It postponed Barbarossa by about 5 weeks, pushing the invasion into late June instead of early May. Many argue that this delay meant the Wehrmacht ran into the Russian winter before Moscow could be taken. Yet weather records complicate this claim. Even if Barbarossa had started in May, the Rasputitsa mud and logistical challenges would still have slowed the Germans. And the Red Army's ability to mobilize reserves from the Urals and Siberia meant that Moscow might still have held. The delay mattered, but it was not the sole reason for failure. A powerful German legend emerged after the war, that the Wehrmacht was defeated by General Winter. Freezing temperatures, snow, and ice, it was said, robbed Germany of victory at the gates of Moscow. The truth is harsher. The Germans failed because their entire strategy was based on false assumptions. They underestimated Soviet manpower, industry, and resilience. They advanced too far, too fast, with supply lines stretched beyond breaking. They had no reserves to exploit their victories. The winter was brutal, but it exposed weaknesses already fatal. As one German general later admitted, we did not lose because of winter. We lost because we miscalculated everything. Within the German High Command, another controversy raged: should the focus have been Moscow, or the resources of Ukraine and the oil fields of the Caucasus? Hitler insisted on both. In summer 1941, he diverted forces southward for the Kiev encirclement, capturing over 600,000 Soviet troops. It was the largest single battle of annihilation in history, but it delayed the drive on Moscow until October. By the time Operation Typhoon began, the rains had turned roads to mud. Some generals argued that if the Wehrmacht had driven straight for Moscow in August, the city would have fallen before winter. Others countered that the Soviet Union was too vast, its reserves too deep, for a single blow to be decisive. Even had Moscow fallen, the Soviet state might have continued the war from the Urals. The debate remains unresolved. Another myth, encouraged by German propaganda, was that the Soviet Union was on the brink of collapse. By the end of 1941, the Red Army had lost over 3 million men captured, countless more killed or wounded, and vast swathes of territory. Any other nation might have surrendered. Yet the Soviet Union did not. Factories relocated east kept producing. Entire new armies were raised. Civilians, despite famine and terror, supported the war effort. The German failure to account for Soviet endurance was perhaps the greatest miscalculation of all. Finally, some argue that Barbarossa was inevitable. Nazi ideology demanded war in the East. Hitler had promised Lebensraum in Mein Kampf. Stalin, for his part, knew that Germany's rise made confrontation unavoidable. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had only postponed the conflict. In this view, Barbarossa was not a choice but a collision of two irreconcilable systems. Yet inevitability does not absolve failure. Hitler's decision to invade in 1941 was his own. His insistence on annihilation, his refusal to plan for a long war, and his contempt for the Soviet people transformed a gamble into catastrophe. The controversies remain, but the facts are clear. Barbarossa was not lost because of weather alone, nor saved by some Soviet plan to attack first. It failed because Germany underestimated its enemy, overestimated itself, and launched a war of annihilation that only hardened Soviet resistance. In the ruins of 1941 lay the truth: Hitler had gambled everything on Barbarossa. By winter, he had failed. The war he thought would last weeks was becoming a struggle that would consume Germany itself. By January 1942, the dream of a swift German victory had collapsed. The Wehrmacht, battered and frozen, had been forced back from the gates of Moscow. What began 6 months earlier as the largest invasion in history had ended in the first great defeat of Nazi Germany. The scale of losses defies comprehension. In the first 6 months of Barbarossa, the Red Army suffered more than 4 million casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. Entire armies had been annihilated. Cities from Minsk to Kiev lay in ruins. Villages across Belarus and Ukraine were erased, their names lost forever. Millions of Soviet civilians were dead, executed, starved, or driven from their homes. But the German toll was also staggering. By the end of 1941, the Wehrmacht had suffered over 750,000 casualties. Tens of thousands more froze to death in the Russian winter. Supplies were exhausted, equipment worn beyond repair. Blitzkrieg, the strategy that had brought Germany triumph in Europe, had broken against the depth of Russia. Barbarossa created a new reality, the Eastern Front. From the Arctic to the Black Sea, a line of battle now stretched more than 2,000 miles. This was no longer a campaign, it was a war within a war, the decisive front of World War II.
Shows the Battle of
For the next
Stalingrad
4
during
years,
World War II.
this front would consume the
deadliest
bulk
battle
of
in
German
history,
strength.
fought between Nazi Germany and the
80%
Soviet
of
Union.
German military casualties in the entire war would occur in the East. Hitler had unleashed a conflict he could not control, one that would bleed the Reich dry. The failure of Barbarossa also reshaped the global war. While German armies stalled outside Moscow, Japan struck at Pearl Harbor, and Hitler declared war on the United States. A conflict that had been European became truly global. The Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States would now stand together in an alliance of necessity. Hitler had not only failed to destroy one enemy, he had guaranteed war with 3. For the Soviet Union, Barbarossa was both catastrophe and crucible. No other nation in the Second World War bore such losses in so short a time. Yet from the ashes, the USSR emerged hardened, mobilized, and determined. The Great Patriotic War became a defining myth of Soviet identity, one built on sacrifice, endurance, and eventual victory. For Germany, Barbarossa marked the beginning of the end. The Nazi state had gambled everything on destroying the Soviet Union in months. Instead, it found itself locked in a war of attrition it could not win. Every mile gained in 1941 became a mile to be defended in 1942, 1943, and beyond. The Reich's resources, manpower, and morale would never recover from the failure of Barbarossa. Barbarossa was more than a military failure. It was the opening act of a genocidal project. The starvation of cities, the massacre of prisoners, the extermination of Jews and other civilians, all began under its shadow. The Holocaust in Eastern Europe cannot be separated from Barbarossa. It was invasion and annihilation, conquest and extermination, fused into one. Historians argue over many details, the delays, the intelligence failures, the decisions of generals. But the legacy is beyond dispute. Barbarossa turned World War II into a struggle that would decide the fate of Europe and the world. In June 1941, Hitler had reached the height of his power. By January 1942, his aura of invincibility was broken. The Reich had chosen to fight an enemy it could not destroy. From that moment, the clock began to tick not toward German victory, but toward German defeat. Operation Barbarossa began in triumph and ended in ruin. In June 1941, Hitler's armies surged east with the confidence of victors, believing they would crush the Soviet Union in weeks. By the winter, they stood broken before Moscow, reeling from defeat, their aura of invincibility shattered. But the true legacy of Barbarossa lies not only in battles won and lost, but in the human cost. Behind every mapped line were millions of lives extinguished. Entire communities, Jewish towns in Ukraine, villages in Belarus, families across the Baltic, vanished into pits, prisons, and hunger. Millions of Soviet soldiers perished in captivity, starved or executed. Civilians were enslaved, deported, or left to die in burned-out villages. The soil of Eastern Europe became a graveyard without boundaries. Barbarossa was Hitler's greatest gamble, but it was also his greatest crime. It fused conquest with extermination, strategy with ideology. Its failure ensured that Nazi Germany would never win the war, but its brutality ensured that the scars would last for generations. For the Soviet Union, the invasion was catastrophe, but also the crucible of its survival. From the ruins of Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev, from the hunger of Leningrad and the ashes of countless villages, came a determination to endure. The Great Patriotic War became not only a defense of land, but of existence itself. For the world, Barbarossa was the turning point. It ensured that the Second World War would not be decided in weeks or months, but in years of grinding struggle. It drew the Soviet Union into alliance with Britain and the United States, sealing the fate of Hitler's Reich. The uncensored truth of Barbarossa is that it was more than a campaign. It was a vision of empire built on annihilation, a war that turned Europe's east into a wasteland of hunger and blood. Its failure marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, but its shadow stretched long beyond 1941. Even today, the graves of Barbarossa lie scattered across fields, forests, and cities, silent witnesses to the moment when hubris met endurance, when ideology met survival, and when history itself turned.